Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, the Achilles Systems Hack Assessment Series, Part 1, Breach or Blueprint, Building a Threat-Informed Defense. Today's featured speaker is Mark Orlando, SANS Certified Instructor and co-author of the SANS LDR 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers course. If during the webcast you have any questions for Mark, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing in the next 48 hours and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Mark.
Thanks, Lauren. Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 1 of our series. I'm excited to get into it today with you all. This is the second series of this kind that we've done, where we take a fictional organization who has recently experienced a breach or a security incident of some sort, and we use that to talk about some of the concepts and methodologies and approaches that we go over in some of the courses that are included in our operational leadership triad. Now, before we get into Achilles Systems and part 1 of the Hack Assessment series, where we talk about what's gone on and what we're going to do about it, I do want to take a few minutes to talk about what this idea of operational cybersecurity leadership triad is. This is a group of 3 related courses at SANS that include the course that I co-authored, Leadership 551, which is Building and Leading Security Operations Centers, as well as 566 and 516. You're going to hear more about those a little bit later and in subsequent episodes of our series. But we wanted to take this opportunity to share, again, some of the key concepts and approaches and methodologies that we get into a lot more detail on in these courses. So you may hear us refer to the triad or the leadership triad a few times. That's what that's all about. That being said, allow me to introduce myself. Why am I the one here talking to you today about building security operations centers, about assessing the damage and responding to this fictional incident at Achilles Systems? Well, frankly, no one else was available. No, I'm kidding. As Lauren mentioned, I'm a certified instructor at SANS. I'm also the co-author of Leadership 551. In addition to that, I teach SEC 450, which is Security Operations and Analysis. I've got about 23 years of experience in security operations. I've worked as a SOC analyst. I've built and led teams here in the US in the public sector, at the White House, the Pentagon, Department of Energy, several other government agencies. In the private sector, I've spent a lot of time as a consultant and delivering managed security services to various clients. And today, when I'm not teaching, I'm working on courses for SANS. I am the co-founder and CEO of a cyber defense company called Bionic. We spend a lot of time working with, engaging with, assisting security operations teams. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about and working on a lot of the challenges and the things that we're going to go over today. Speaking of, what are we going to cover? Over the next several minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about our fictional company, Achilles Systems. We're going to talk about the breach that they've experienced, why they experienced that breach, what we can do to not only resolve that issue, but help them avoid a similar fate in the future, or at least handle it maybe a little bit better than they handled it this time. I'm going to talk about the approach that we want to take to building out and, in fact, expanding Achilles Systems security operations capabilities. We're going to talk about the role of cyber threat intelligence in that process. We'll talk about various SOC functions and frameworks, functions like collection, detection, incident response, which is of particular interest here, considering we're on the tail end of a major incident. We'll also talk about ways to measure and assess security operations capabilities, which, in my experience, can be one of the most challenging parts of detection and response activities. Then we'll wrap it up, talk about what we've learned in doing this exercise and where we can go from here. With that, let's talk about Achilles Systems, our fictional US-based IT service provider to corporate HR teams. Again, Achilles, fictional organization delivering both software as a service and staff augmentation to various human resources teams all across the country and, in fact, all around the world. That staff augmentation solution is delivered via remote access, where Achilles Systems employees remotely connect in to customer networks to access the Achilles software and deliver services based on that software. Now, unlike our previous hack assessment series, where we focused on a fictional US casino organization that historically had not really invested at all in cybersecurity, Achilles Systems has prioritized cybersecurity. They've made investments in preventative controls, in detections. Now let's dig into what some of those investments look like in our fictional organization. First off, their defensive measures are primarily aligned to CIS controls, Center for Internet Security, critical security controls, prioritized list of preventative measures designed to have the greatest impact in resisting all different kinds of cyber threats. Now that's great. That's a great start. And like many organizations, this effort is still a work in progress at Achilles. There's a basic detection and response tool set as well. That includes things like network security monitoring and endpoint security, and even a security information and event management system, or a SIM. Some of the more recent improvements to cybersecurity at Achilles include implementation of multi-factor authentication and the rollout of an endpoint detection and response capability to all of its clients. Monitoring and response up until now has been a shared responsibility performed on an ad hoc basis by a relatively small IT security team. So pretty standard situation compared to other medium-sized companies like Achilles. And this all sounds like pretty good progress, right? Achilles has even passed multiple third-party security audits, even though most of those audits have been primarily administrative and or very limited in the scope of what's being audited. So on paper, Achilles looks like it's doing pretty well. They've invested in cybersecurity. They're focused on those CIS controls, doing the right things from a detection and response perspective. Now, like at least some of us, hopefully not many of us, this doesn't mean that our security is absolute, right? We know that preventative controls, we know that detection and response will eventually fail. And unfortunately, that's what happened to Achilles Systems. I'm not going to read this whole slide to you. There are a lot of words. Sorry about that. But the key takeaway here is that a determined, relatively sophisticated attacker targeted Achilles Systems, recognized that there was a wealth of potentially sensitive customer data, that there was access to other customer networks. Both of these characteristics make Achilles a pretty prime target for a lot of different types of adversaries. And in this case, the attacker gained initial access to the Achilles environment by impersonating an Achilles executive, an Achilles user, in a call to the service desk to adjust, change some user profile details, change the multi-factor authentication setup, adding a new device that was controlled by the adversary. So that's how they gained entry. They were able to move through the environment and along the way even disabled some of Achilles' EDR agents. The attack was only discovered when a system administrator discovered evidence of a data exfiltration tool deployed by the attackers, which is a pretty common step by ransomware groups and other adversaries prior to deploying a more destructive attack like encrypting data. Now, unfortunately, due to a lack of log data for certain key data sources like backend systems for the Achilles SaaS platform and a few other key assets, it's kind of difficult to know the full extent of the attacker's access, but it does seem like some sensitive customer data was exfiltrated by the attacker. So not great. Now, as Achilles works to recover from the incident, try to claw back some of that customer trust, they've engaged another third-party vendor to come in and assist with their incident response. So doing some of that forensic analysis, that recovery, that incident management, not really part of our scope today. We've been brought in to advise on security operations, vulnerability assessment, improved security controls, kind of the what are we going to do now post-incident. So that's where our focus is going to be today. Now let's talk about what got us here. Because remember, it sounded like we were doing the right things, but we still got hacked. And this is the reality for at least some of you viewing this webcast. You're doing the right things. There were some failures in the system. Now we need to go back and analyze those failures to decide how we're going to avoid those in the future, right? What can we do better? What can we learn from this? So let's start by analyzing some of the contributing factors in this incident. And we know that the controls have been deployed. They're being maintained, but unfortunately, in this case, they're not being assessed or improved. And in the last several years, Achilles' customer base has grown substantially, and it's now global. So they are effectively a 24/7 service provider. They've got users and customers who are active all the time, around the clock. Unfortunately, their relatively small internal IT security team still operates in a reactive mode. And a lot of the successes here, including the success in identifying this attack, hinges on a few key individuals doing the right things. So we're relying on superheroes a little bit more than, the system that we've built to be effective in identifying and mitigating security threats. Another problem here is that that detection and response, it's ad hoc. So using that SIM, using some of the security tools tends to take a back seat when it goes up against project work, audit support, other initiatives. Does it sound familiar? It's easy to get bogged down in some of those very important tasks, but then some of that continuous monitoring, that investigative work, that kind of falls by the wayside or it takes a back seat. Achilles also hasn't really done anything to validate detections and preventative controls. There's no overarching framework, no strategy, no long-term plan for the security capabilities that have been deployed. So it's very unlikely that security has continued to evolve and continue to grow at the same pace as the Achilles Systems business. And we know that security needs to be aligned to the business, needs to be aligned to those business functions. And we can't just trust that the controls that we've deployed or the detection and investigation that we're doing is going to work as intended, right? We want to test, gather empirical data that shows us that these functions, these controls are working as designed. And that wasn't happening here. Now, all that being said, what are the logical next steps? Achilles has invested in security. We know they were breached anyway. That's kind of all of our worst nightmare, right? We talked about some of the specific oversights that led to that. Now let's talk about some of the underlying conceptual failures or mindset failures, chief among which is the defenders at Achilles Systems engaged in what we call list thinking versus graph thinking. There's a popular quote by Microsoft's John Lambert. It says, defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. And essentially the concept here is that an attacker is not going to be stopped, or at least a determined attacker won't be stopped by a list of controls. So if you're thinking in terms of, well, I need to deploy firewall, I need to deploy network IDS and an IPS and an endpoint solution, and if I just check all those boxes, at some point, pretty much any attacker or most attackers will get tripped up, they'll get stopped, they'll get delayed, and they'll move on, right? They'll be unsuccessful. But that doesn't really line up with the attacker mindset, right? If I'm an adversary and I run into a security control, I'm not going to think, only that firewall was a little bit more permissive, right? No, I'm going to figure out another way in, a way around those controls, right? And I might use slightly different tactics. I might shift my avenue of approach, right? I'm going to be more creative than that. So as defenders, we need to adopt that kind of graph thinking too. Right? We need to use those offensive tactics and techniques to inform our defenses. Achilles didn't do that when they designed their defenses. They also didn't align their controls well enough to Achilles' business model or threat model, which obviously now includes relatively sophisticated or at least very persistent attackers. Given the relatively small investment in reviewing alerts, investigating potential incidents, seems that they have focused very heavily on prevention over detection. We know both of those are important, but we also know that prevention eventually fails. So we need to have that detection-oriented defense. And we're going to use this hack, we're going to use this incident as a blueprint for deploying, right, building, implementing that more proactive detection-oriented defense. We're also going to talk in a few minutes about how we can set measurable specific goals and track our progress towards those goals, which is not always easy to do when you're talking about detections and investigations, right? Response. So here's our approach. Coming out of this incident, we need to adopt a threat-informed defense, meaning any monitoring, any assessment we want to do, it has to be informed by our understanding of our adversaries, their tactics and techniques, and it has to be constantly evolving and constantly improving, right? We want to be aligned to threats that we know about, some of which, unfortunately, we've had a front row seat in observing very recently. The vulnerabilities that we know exist in our environment, critical assets, and a lot of these insights we can get from internal intelligence. We also need to track external intelligence, what we know about all the bad things that are happening out there on the internet that may at some point impact us. Now, one of the ways that we're going to do that is we're going to set up a central hub where we can do these kinds of recurring investigative detection response activities, right, on a continuous basis. Meaning, we're going to build a SOC, a security operations center. Right? So step one is we take what we can from this incident, use it as a blueprint, as a learning opportunity. We reevaluate, re-baseline what we already have in place, and we move things forward along this maturity curve to adopt a more effective, more measurable, more proactive security posture. Sound good? Let's keep going. Now, some guiding principles before we move out here. We want to be able to collect and apply intelligence on an ongoing basis. So that threat intelligence activity just needs to be part of those operational tasks that happen all the time. We're going to use that intelligence to think more like an attacker. What are the things in the Achilles environment that I might want to go after, like our critical SaaS application, like access to our customer networks, like sensitive customer data? We want to continuously assess, measure, and improve our prevention and detection, which means testing those on a repetitive basis. We also want to use standards, frameworks, and guidelines where possible. Now, a lot of operators I know on the blue team don't get super excited when they hear the words standards, frameworks, guidelines, documentation, right? And I get that. But here's why standards and frameworks and guidelines are really important. No one likes to reinvent the wheel, start from scratch. More importantly, when we're finished advising at Achilles and we move on to the next challenge or the next organization, anyone who comes after us needs to be able to understand why we have designed these processes, these procedures, these capabilities the way we have. So using existing standards and frameworks to do that gives us a little bit better transparency, gives us a head start on building out some of these things, and it helps us all establish a shared mindset for how these things should work and what they should look like. So that's why I'm a big fan of using those standards and those frameworks. We'll talk about some of those in a few minutes. Above all else, we need to make sure that we've implemented a layered detection approach. We saw in this incident that some of our preventative controls, including multi-factor authentication, including perimeter detections, those weren't really sufficient to resist this particular attacker. So what we need to do is revisit our detections to give us multiple different opportunities to detect attacks like this one, even at later stages of the attack, when the attacker is elevating their privileges, when they're moving laterally through the environment, they're getting ready to steal our data or unleash some kind of destructive attack, right? That means a layered detection approach. So step one, we're going to get this house in order. That starts with stripping it down to the studs, so to speak. We want to revisit our mission, our goals for the security team. And we need to think about requirements, not unlike any other project that you would undertake. In this case, we had some kind of failure to meet security requirements. Now, is that because the requirements weren't met? Is that because we had requirements that weren't sufficiently identified? Maybe both. So in revisiting our security requirements, right, before we expand and build out our SOC, we want to look at regulatory requirements. What types of data does Achilles store and process? Are there any functions that are going to subject them to regulatory scrutiny? What kind of control frameworks do they want to adopt? What kind of cybersecurity policies are in place? Are there any cybersecurity policies in place? And what are the unique needs of all of their constituents that include customers of their SaaS product, staff augmentation customers, their customers, their stakeholders, right? We're dealing with HR teams. So do we also need to think about maybe the security and privacy needs of their users? Because trafficking in and collecting potentially all the sensitive data. All of these things are going to add to our list of requirements for the types of security capabilities, security services that we need to deliver. But we can't do that alone. Sometimes when I'm teaching Leadership 551, we're talking about building out a SOC and establishing that framework that we're going to operate in. It seems like a really tall order for a SOC manager, for security manager, or even for a CISO in some cases to identify all the needs of the business when it comes to security. And it is a pretty tall order. So it makes sense then to deputize or engage representatives from across the organization and form a steering committee. Now, this steering committee, fortunately, kind of already ready-made for us, right? Given that we've just experienced a major incident, there hopefully is a cross-functional team of individuals, including leadership, management, other key stakeholders, that now is probably very, very familiar with security, with the incident. This is a great opportunity to grab their attention, use those stakeholders as our kind of first cut of a steering committee who can bring us requirements from across the organization, challenges from across the organization, and help us put together the list of services that the SOC needs to deliver. Now, I'm going to ask a question to all of you of the rhetorical variety. Who do you think should be part of this committee? Now, think about that. Maybe executive leadership, maybe division heads from across the organization, maybe executives representing certain key customers even. Those are the types of individuals you want to be able to inject requirements into your security planning for your SOC. Now, we need to expand the team. So we know that Achilles historically has had a relatively small IT security team. They're doing project work. They're doing audit preparation. They're doing some detection and response whenever they have time. Now that we're going to expand that group to include a security operations center, we need to think about what kind of knowledge, skills, abilities, or KSAs, and what kind of capacity that team needs to have. One of the most common mistakes that I see in organizations staffing up a SOC or security team is in thinking that all security analysts, all incident responders, all intel analysts are more or less the same. And if I write a relatively generic job description for a SOC analyst, I might make some tweaks here and there. I might have something that's very specific to our environment. But by and large, if you've been a SOC analyst pretty much anywhere else in the past, you might be a fit for my job description. The reality is there's a lot of nuance to this work. Right? There are lots of different skills, lots of different abilities that we might find out there, some of which are going to be very appropriate to what we're trying to do at Achilles, some of which maybe not so much. Fortunately, there is an existing framework. There are actually a few different ones. I'm going to talk about one here that gives us a ready-built, very detailed catalog of these KSA, these knowledge, skills, and abilities. And we can use that catalog, pick and choose what is relevant to us to build robust, detailed, and tailored job descriptions for all of the roles that we need to fill in our new Achilles SOC. That framework is the NIST NICE framework. Tons and tons of resources freely available out on the internet. We talk about the NICE framework a little bit in Leadership 551. And one of the things I always be sure to mention is that, like any model, like any framework, right, there's a great saying that I really love, and it is that all models are wrong, some are useful. So like any framework, you have to take what's useful and what makes sense and kind of disregard the rest. Now, the NIST NICE framework was designed for cybersecurity roles in the US federal government. So there may be things on there that don't really map to what we need at Achilles Systems, but it's much, much further down the path than we might get in building these things up from scratch. So I want to share a link to the NICE framework. In case you want to check that out. So we need to think about what KSAs we need as part of this expanded team. We also need to think about what our capacity needs are. Now, this, quite honestly, is one of my favorite exercises that we do in class, and it's a relatively involved one. But essentially, we need to think about how much workload we expect to be created within this team. So let's take a look at the sim, since we already have one. How many alerts are getting generated? How long does it take on average to assess and triage and investigate those alerts? How much time are we spending on those other tasks that we're doing? And based on how many hours we expect to need to review alerts, uh, to do those investigations, to respond to incidents, how many people, right? How much headcount are we going to need to add to the team in order to handle that capacity? We don't want to deal with just basic averages. We want to look at what quiet days look like at Achilles, what busy days look like at Achilles, kind of triangulate based on that, right? So we're looking at KSAs and capacity. Those are some key variables that will help us build out the team in a smart way, use our resources wisely. We also need to select some kind of maturity framework, which will act as a roadmap for us to improve and expand our capabilities. Now, any kind of strategy, any kind of strategic improvement starts with this sort of roadmap. So we say, here's where we are today. We're an organization with some security capabilities. They're relatively limited. We were just breached. Here's the state of where we are. Here's where we want to be long term. We need some kind of roadmap or framework that we can measure ourselves against. And here are some of the most common ones, some of my favorites, starting with the SOC Capability Maturity Model, or SOC CMM. SOC CMM, loosely based on CMMI, Capability Maturity Model, and it's aligned to several standards and process frameworks like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, ISO 27001, COBIT. COBIT consists of 5 different domains, 25 aspects that you can measure. And it's a continuous maturity and capability model where you can track technical capability of your services that you're delivering, but also like organizational and process maturity. So it's a very detailed, very robust model. Some other kind of similar models, the ANISA CCERT maturity framework and the CREST cybersecurity incident response maturity framework, which is a mouthful. Both of these are a bit more incident response focused, which could be more appropriate here. They measure, compared to SOC CMM, fewer elements, fewer aspects. But again, if we're just getting started and we want a slightly simpler model, these latter two might be more appropriate. I have a star next to SOC CMM, happens to be my personal favorite. And I use it all the time to assess various SOC teams and CCERT and CSOCs and so forth. So that's one I like. But what's important is that we pick a model and we use that as a yardstick to measure our progress. Now, the first of our SOC functions that we want to revisit here, we're thinking about having a threat-informed defense. Well, we need to start with some kind of intelligence, some kind of research. We have to do our homework on what adversaries we're likely to face or what kind of adversaries, what their goals and motivations are, what their tactics and techniques are, what those tactics and techniques might look like inside of the Achilles environment. Fortunately or unfortunately for us, incidents and investigations are 2 of the best sources of threat intelligence. Here you have an attack that's happening in your environment. You've got all the evidence, hopefully, all the data that you could want to tell you what infrastructure the attacker is using, right? Observables like domains, files, file hashes, IP addresses, right? Those indicators of compromise with investigative context. We have some indication of what the goals of the adversary were. In this case, sensitive data, clearly they were after. We can see very clearly what the weaknesses are in our preventative controls and our detections. So that cyber threat intelligence can help us better understand these things and design our controls and our detections to match, right? At a high level, the intelligence about this incident tells us that we're dealing with a relatively sophisticated type of adversary. Seems that they may have used an AI tool to impersonate that executive. It was a voice call to the service desk, right? Sounded just like this executive who was known to a lot of the service desk members. The attacker knew their target. They had specific objectives in mind. All of these point to a targeted attack by a relatively sophisticated attacker. Now, how are we going to operationalize that intelligence? How are we going to put it to work for us? So we're talking not only about that internal incident information as a type of intelligence, but also external research, right? Descriptions of adversaries, campaigns, incidents at similar organizations. So we take those various sources of intelligence. We're going to have some strategic intel. It gives us a sense of, kind of high level attacker goals, high level types of threats. Operational intelligence would be more like tactics, techniques, procedures, campaigns. And we've got tactical intelligence, which would be like your IOC level intel. All of these inform our threat model, right? What the attacker wants, how they're likely to try to get it, as well as our analytics and our preventative controls. So here's what an attack looks like. Here's how to look for it in your organization. So this flow chart on this slide is meant to demonstrate how you would take these three different types of intelligence and apply them to not only preventative controls, but your analytics, your detections as well. Now it's time to build out, or at least revisit, core security operations functions. And we've divided operational functions into 5 main functional areas, and we have a 6th cross-cutting function. So we've got collection, detection, triage, investigation, and incident response. That cross-cutting function is feedback and continuous improvement. So it's not enough just to build these functions out. We need to check and measure them at every step of the process. So if there are defects in the process, if one of these is not working as designed, we're not going to get the output or the outcomes that we expect. So we want to take that, measurement, continuous improvement approach to each function. Now remember, in the case of Achilles Systems, it looks like they've already made some investments in collection, detection, even in investigation and response. But it seems that in this case, these functions did not operate the way we would have wanted them to, or the way that we would expect. So we've got some gaps in that continuous improvement and that measurement. May also have some gaps in these specific detections, data collection. So we need to reevaluate, kind of re-baseline those functions as well. And we talked about how we've got a few gaps maybe in our data collection and our logging. So we already know that if we're going to assess each of these functional areas, we're going to have some gaps to fill. But this is a great model to ensure that we're covering all of those key detection and response functions, even if ultimately Achilles decides to engage an MSSP or use an external consultant. We still want to make sure that somebody, somewhere, somehow is covering each of these 5, well, let's say 6 core SOC functions. So let's talk collection and detection. If we're going to reevaluate our data collection, our logging, our network monitoring, endpoint monitoring, we need to identify what our key data sources are. And again, we want to do that in a way that is informed by what we've learned in this incident and by what we know about the threat landscape at large. And we can use another fairly popular, well-known industry framework, which is MITRE ATT&CK, which is a catalog of attacker tactics, techniques, sub-techniques. So we know we've got some basic network and endpoint monitoring in place, but we've identified some of those gaps, which you can see listed here. Right? And we can catalog those gaps using MITRE ATT&CK TTPs as a reference. And then we can map those data sources, or we can map those attacks, excuse me, to specific data sources and to preventative controls, which are also enumerated in the MITRE ATT&CK model. That's right. Happen to really like it. It's one of the most useful kind of use cases for MITRE ATT&CK is cataloging all of the things that we're worried about, right? Attacker tactics, techniques, sub-techniques, and then identifying necessary data sources and maybe preventative controls that cover those tactics and techniques. So again, another reference, another framework that we can use to reassess, baseline our data collection. Once we've done that, we need to think about how we're going to build out our detection pipeline. And for me, and I know for my co-author, John Hubbard, we often talk about this idea of a pipeline or like a manufacturing type process, assembly line, kind of choose your metaphor. But there are these core functions that are happening and they're kind of feeding into each other. So we have detection, triage, investigation, response, right? Each function has to work well in order for the next function to have what it needs to work well, right? And ultimately, we want to get to that closed case. We want to identify those incidents and remediate them before there's an impact, or at least minimized impact. So we need to think about the efficiency and the effectiveness of each step in this process or in this detection pipeline. When it comes to generating alerts, we want to make sure that we're not collecting tons and tons of useless data that has little to no security value, right? Those true negatives. So if I'm thinking about all of the events, all of the logs that I want to collect, if I have a log source that has zero security value, it just says, hey, something normal is happening in the network. And there is no situation where that might be indicative of something malicious. Well, I really need to think about whether it's worth the cost to collect that data. So we need to use frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK, use what we know about what attacks might look like in the environment to guide our data collection process. We also want to minimize wasted cycles, which we're going to run into every time our small but growing team reviews an alert that ends up being a false positive, or maybe something we don't care about. So we want to keep those wasted cycles to a minimum by continuously tuning, enriching the underlying data sources, maybe introducing automation, right, to help us handle, triage, investigate all of the detections or all of the alerts that we create. Later in the process or later in the pipeline, when we're doing investigation, we're responding to incidents in the future, we need to maintain high quality standards, look for analytic completeness, accuracy, keep those quality standards high to minimize premature case closure, right? Missing kind of important evidence or key details, misclassifying an incident, rework where we have to open a case up and kind of go through it again because it wasn't done correctly the first time, right? So think about this in terms of, kind of lean manufacturing. We want to minimize waste, minimize wasted time, right? Minimize rework, keep quality high. Kind of a helpful visual guide for thinking about what your detection pipeline looks like now that we're going to have a team to be able to review those detections. Detection-oriented defense also means that we're hunting for threats. So we don't only want to rely on automated alerts. Right? Even after we have built out our SOC and we have some of these key functions, up and running, we may not fare too well against a determined, sophisticated attacker if we're only relying on alerts. So we want to proactively get out there, comb through the data, hunt for threats that have failed to generate an alert, maybe threats that are not obvious at first glance. So think back to those KSAs. The ideal hunter in our team will have solid analysis skills, right? Good investigative mindset. They're going to know the network very, very well, including network architecture, operating systems, asset types, the data types, and the environment. They're also going to have a strong command of all of the tools and the data sources that they're going to manipulate in order to identify anomalies and suspicious and malicious activity. They need to understand attacker tactics and techniques and tradecraft. They need to be aware of their own biases and able to overcome those biases, right? So we need solid investigators in the team to perform proactive hunting or threat hunting as part of that detection function. What else do we need? Certainly need smart people. We need good data, right? High quality data to be able to search through. Hopefully, we've already got quite a bit of that. We need well-defined schedule, rotation, process, a method of documenting and tracking our hunts. And we want this task to be well integrated with that detection pipeline so that when we hunt for a threat and we come across new use cases, new analytics, vulnerabilities, okay, that should feed back into our detection pipeline. So we do a hunt, we find something new, we build it back into our detections. Now, once we identify those future threats, those future potential incidents, we need to think about incident response. So which systems do we need IR capabilities for in the Achilles environment? We know that includes SaaS, right? Maybe some cloud infrastructure. We know that includes servers, user systems, et cetera. So for each of these asset types, we need to revisit our staffing plan. Achilles, not a huge company. Like any company, they're going to have limited resources. So for each of these systems where we know we'll need to perform incident response at some point, can we do that just using our SOC staff? Do we need to outsource some of these capabilities? Are there auxiliary or specialty functions like forensic analysis, malware analysis, right, that will require engaging some kind of external third party? What are the data retention requirements, regulatory requirements to which Achilles is subject, and what's the impact of all of that on how we perform incident response? So fortunately for us, again, fortunately, unfortunately, now's a great time for an after action review if one hasn't already been conducted. So we can get in the room with the investigators, responders, system owners, and other stakeholders, talk about what went well, what gaps we have in our incident response process, what can be improved in Achilles IR functions moving forward, right? Hopefully we won't have to rely on that, emergency engagement of probably very expensive incident response experts to come in, unless that's part of, a deliberate part of our strategy. Finally, we need to think about kind of what the post-incident inputs to our new security operations function will look like. And some of those key inputs, if we think about things that are going to be very tangible, hopefully available, would be the incident report. We talked about gathering threat intelligence on the heels of this incident, indicators of compromise, TTPs, any kind of strategic considerations based on what we've seen, may need to make changes in network architecture, may need to make process changes, engage new partners, things like that. We need to think about necessary changes in our preventative security and in our detections. We may need to continue doing some focused monitoring of impacted assets. Remember all the way back at the beginning, when I told you about the incident, right, we talked about how, well, we're missing some log data. It's kind of unclear the full extent of the attacker access. So for some of those critical systems where we think the attacker might have had access, maybe, maybe not, we may want to focus on those assets, enable more verbose, logging, more robust monitoring for the foreseeable future to make sure that we've fully contained the threat. And finally, if there are any incident response plans or procedures, now is a great time to capture that feedback, put those changes into the IR plans and procedures. So the last piece that we're going to talk about today is we're making all those improvements, right? We're learning from our mistakes. We're learning from the incident, and that's all great. But if we're not measuring the performance of all these shiny new capabilities, if we're not tracking our progress, well, we might find ourselves in a very similar situation in a few months or a year from now. We don't want to do that. So we want to make sure that we're tracking the success of our brand new SOC. And that means tracking both daily operations, right? Those detection, investigation, triage, all those ongoing operational tasks that are happening all the time. We want to measure those. We also want to measure any project work and improvements that we're making in the wake of our incident. So we can use KPIs or key performance indicators to track those ongoing operational activities. And we can use OKRs or objectives and key results to measure improvement initiatives. We need both of those in order to measure whether or not we are achieving our goals, right? Measure success in the SOC. So let's talk about these two measurement types in a little bit more detail, starting with KPIs, key performance indicators. So for each KPI, we need to figure out what is it we're measuring, right? Alerts per week. This is separate from any, is this good? Is this bad? Any criteria. It's strictly the thing we're measuring. We should also, on top of that, have some kind of target or threshold. So out of alerts per week or incidents per week or per month, here is where it needs to fall in order for us to consider it normal. Then we figure out what data sources can give us these insights, and we need to think about how often we're going to sample and measure that process. So for example, are we going to track major incidents per hour? Hopefully not. Are we going to track major incidents per quarter, per month, per year? Well, maybe that seems a little bit more realistic. So at a minimum, we need to define these for our operational KPIs. Now, for OKRs, we need to think about what our objectives or our desired outcomes are. Let's say we want to deploy some additional preventative controls, or we want to change, our incident response capabilities. What are those desired outcomes? What are some key results that will tell us that we have succeeded in achieving those? These key results should be specific. They should be quantifiable. And then what initiatives, what tasks are we going to undertake to make sure that those results materialize? Right? So those are OKRs. Devising and using KPIs and OKRs, it's a relatively straightforward process that nevertheless can be a little bit time-consuming, a little bit challenging. But at a very high level, it looks like this. We identify what our goals are for our new SOC and for our security functions. Clarify the meaning of those goals. So what is going to tell me that I'm getting there, that I'm achieving those goals? We figure out the best choices for the data sources that we're going to pull to give us those answers. We're going to use that data to develop those KPIs, OKRs, and then we monitor, right, on an ongoing basis. That's how we control these processes. That's how we track the progress of our improvement initiatives. Finally, we need to make sure that whatever improvements we make, whether it's new controls, new detections, that we are constantly assessing and testing those. Not only when they're first deployed, but also using adversary emulation, purple team assessments, red team assessments, penetration tests to continuously and on a recurring basis, I guess that's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Test these things to ensure that they function as anticipated. And once again, if we're standardizing on that attack matrix of attacker tactics and techniques, we can use that to prioritize, organize, track our detection and prevention use cases, right? Not only for coverage purposes, but also how they perform when we assess them, when we test them. Now, in conclusion, Achilles Systems saw the need for security, saw that it was important, made some good choices, made investments, but it wasn't enough to stop a determined attacker. In some ways, continuing a journey in security operations can be a much bigger challenge than simply starting from scratch, designing it from the ground up. So in this case, we need to learn from the attack, tailor some of our defensive planning. We identified a maturity framework that we can use as a blueprint or a roadmap for those future improvements. We want to revisit requirements and goals. Why do we even need a security capability? What are we bringing to the business? How are we enabling Achilles Systems to be successful in doing those important business functions, right? That help it create value. We talked about building out some of those core security operations functions. We talked about the importance of assessing and monitoring the performance of each function. And we also talked about establishing KPIs, OKRs to make sure that that's happening. And we have the kind of visibility, the kind of transparency into those functions that we're going to need in order to manage them. Now, security operations is just kind of one major building block in helping Achilles sort of evolve from a security perspective coming out of this pretty impactful incident. Preventative controls and frameworks, vulnerability management, these are other equally important pieces. And all three of these kind of fit together. And we're going to talk about those other pieces, preventative controls, frameworks, vulnerability management, in subsequent episodes. Right? So now that we've addressed security operations, make sure that you join us for part 2 of the webcast, where you're going to hear from a colleague of mine, Brian Ventura, who's going to talk about revisiting those enterprise controls. We had some failures, we have some improvements to make. Brian's got a lot to share on that front. Also, feel free while we're here to check out the larger cybersecurity leadership curriculum at SANS. Lots of new courses, lots of major updates to existing courses that are well worth checking out depending on what your focus is or kind of where you spend most of your time when you're not tuning into these excellent webcasts. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. Please feel free to connect, reach out to me with any questions or feedback. Really, really appreciate you all tuning in. And with that, I will open it up to any questions. Those of you who would like to can speak up or drop it in the chat. Otherwise, Lauren, I will turn it back over to you.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Mark, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. And to our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. You can find your CPEs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigate to your account dashboard, then click My Webcasts. You can then download your CPE on the right-hand side of the webpage. Until next time, take care, and we hope to see you in part 2 of this series. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.